Joining us now to talk about all of this and what it means is international attorney Douglas McNabb, who makes a return appearance to the Steve Malzberg Show. Hey, Douglas, how are you, sir?
I am excellent. And how about you, Steve?
I'm fine. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your time. Okay. So the bottom line is, we thought earlier today or last night he was on a plane from Russia to Cuba with the intended destination Ecuador. But as far as the White House is saying, we believe he's still in Russia. So first, let's backtrack and let's talk about what the U.S. did in finally putting a warrant out for his arrest, charging him in that warrant, and requesting his extradition. Hong Kong says that it wasn't legal, it wasn't right, it was flawed. Tell me what you know.
Well, the U.S., pursuant to the terms of the extradition treaty, as you just said, requested a provisional arrest warrant, that is a temporary arrest warrant, asking Hong Kong to temporarily detain Mr. Snowden for up to 60 days. That would give the U.S. time to prepare a full-blown petition for extradition. The provisional arrest warrant request was sent over, and Hong Kong said it's defective. You need to give us more information. In the meantime, apparently Mr. Snowden went to Hong Kong authorities and said, hey, I'd like to travel. I want to fly to Moscow. They said there's no valid provisional arrest warrant in place. They let him get on a plane and flew to Moscow. Now, from a U.S. perspective, U.S. is saying, no, we prepared properly. We prepared a provisional arrest warrant. Hong Kong is just making excuses because they didn't want to deal with it. But what is, that may or may not be true. But what we do know is that the U.S. took a couple of days to revoke Mr. Snowden's passport. They should have done that at the time that the criminal complaint was filed. And number two, they didn't go to Interpol and request Interpol to issue a red notice, a red alert to 190 countries. Hey, if you see this guy, arrest him. So in my view, the U.S. government didn't do what they usually do in these types of cases. So somebody made a mistake along the way.
I remember, Douglas, when we talked 2 weeks ago, you told me about that, and they never did that.
They didn't. They didn't do the red notice request, and what the U.S. government is saying is, well, no, we didn't do it because we knew where he was. We knew he was in Hong Kong. Well, I've never heard that. I've never heard that argument being made, because many times, even if they know where an individual is, they'll go ahead and request an Interpol red notice be filed to landlock the individual, so that if the individual is aware, hey, there's a red notice out there, then they know that they can't travel, because if they travel to country X, go through immigration customs, they'll be arrested. So Mr. Snowden, knowing that, he wouldn't leave the country, which is what the U.S. would want to do, along with revoking his passport. So there are some things that the U.S. government failed to do timely, in my view.
All right, so now he's in Moscow, he's in Russia, or the White House says they believe he's in Russia. Russia now says he's not in the country, so that could be a Clinton speak, if you will. Clintonese, he's not in the country, but he's on the doorstep. And of course, he reportedly wants to go to Ecuador or Cuba, although I believe we have an extradition treaty with Ecuador. No?
Well, we do have an extradition treaty with Cuba, with Ecuador, and with Venezuela. All three of those states, the treaties are very, very old. But getting back to your point about whether he's in Moscow or not, if you're in the passport area of the international airport, you're not apparently on Russian territory. You're sort of in a no man's land, because he's waiting to in this international area to get on another plane to fly out. And so U.S. is saying he's in Moscow. He is kind of. Moscow saying, well, he's not here. Well, that's kind of true, too, because he's in this international area.
Right, but could they they could grab him if they wanted to, right? Especially since we've invalidated his passport, and Russia has to know that.
Well, Russia, I'm sure, does know that, but apparently Assange and his assistants were able to get a refugee travel document for him that would allow him to travel if the airline were to approve it. There's some apparently that will allow one to fly without a passport on this revenue travel document. Some won't. So I don't know if the reason he didn't make the flight this morning is because the airline wouldn't allow him to travel on a refugee travel document or not. I don't know whether perhaps the Russian authorities are having a serious conversation with him and the documents that he has, or whether, he's on another plane going someplace else. It's difficult to know. So the big question is, where is Edward Snowden? And no one seems to know, really.
All right. Now, if he does, and we're talking to Douglas McNabb, an international attorney here on the Steve Malzberg Show. If he does hightail it out of Russia on a plane, or from near Russia onto a plane and to Cuba, Ecuador, whatever, that's it. I mean, there's virtually no shot. I mean, I knew that about Cuba. I wasn't sure about Ecuador, but certainly if he wound up in Cuba, he might as well be Joanne Chesimard or whatever. He's done.
Well, there isn't apparently a direct flight from Moscow to Quito, Ecuador.
Okay.
And so that's the reason, apparently, that he's having to go to
Cuba.
To Cuba.
Yeah.
But the flight from Moscow to Havana flies over the eastern coast of the U.S. into U.S. airspace, which would allow the U.S. to deny that plane the right to fly over U.S. territory, or if the plane were to fly over it, it would certainly give the U.S. the legal right to attempt to force the plane to land on U.S. territory.
Now that is interesting. I haven't heard that yet anywhere. That's very interesting. I would have to say, knowing Barack Obama, he absolutely would never do that. But that's something absolutely that should be done if that's an option. But aside from that, if he lands in Cuba and stays there, or decides to, I heard somebody describe it as whether he wants to drive a 1950s Chevy the rest of his life, or if he wants to. Upgrade to a modern car. So whether he ends up in Cuba or Ecuador, our ability to get him is basically non-existent, correct?
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court, and I'm not suggesting that the U.S. would do this, but the U.S. Supreme Court has said that it is okay for federal agents, U.S. federal agents, to go into another country's territory and in contravention of that foreign country's laws, and kidnap an individual and bring him back to the U.S. And the fact that he was kidnapped in contravention of law is not the basis to have the indictment or the charges dismissed against him.
Wow.
So, and again, the U.S. Supreme Court, based upon a real case scenario where federal agents did do that, have said it's okay unless the specific extradition treaty says thou shalt not kidnap. And of course, we don't have any of our extradition treaties that have that prohibition on them. So there is the right to do that if they were to do that. Again, I'm not suggesting the U.S. will do that, but they do have the right.
Well, you present a lot of interesting scenarios and options for the government, and especially the one in the air. So that's something that we should definitely, I think, as a country, think about. But I want to thank you, Douglas. Thank you very much. A pleasure talking to you. And I'm sure as this chess game continues, although I can't imagine it continuing too much longer, maybe we'll speak again, sir.